how like from his ideology, he believed in like someone who can direct the people, which will be basically the king. And he was mechanistic thinker. So he believed in everything is like work together with pieces. So that's why he was more material. His thinking was more into material thinking type.
Okay, Hassan, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that was most striking to me was the deductive method he applied, and that he would first start out by outlining the principles that he had. And so, as you said,
can you let people in?
Go on, Hassan.
So, as you said, it was similar to Descartes. Well, it was a bit tough actually to try to understand what he's saying. I had to read each paragraph like 3 times to try to get it. I think this theme of what you said, these key points that we need to keep an eye out, equality and the freedom and liberty and the laws of nature. Yeah, they were repeated throughout the passage. And also just talking about justice and injustice and defining what justice is in the state of nature or in the Commonwealth. Yeah.
Professor, there are people waiting to be let into the meeting.
Sorry. They're admitted.
And I would like to add one more thing. I really like when it comes to his explanation of the state of nature, I was a bit surprised because honestly, like all of the things that he explained are also, I feel like, are part of human nature, like diffidence, corruption, competition and glory. Because even though like we feel sympathy towards each other, but still those are the fundamental, elements of humans at the end of the day.
Okay, so that's a lot of that's very good, both of you.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Also, he implies that passions have a fundamental role, and first of all, in the natural state, because in the state of nature, because they control men, as Uwe said, jealousy, competition, and all these things. But in the same time, these same passions, fear, desire, etc., make them scared that the same thing that they do to others will happen to them. So they have fear of death, fear of things like that. So with reason, these passions will help them, will make them realize that there should be certain laws that can prevent such things from happening, that can make them less scared. And this will make the notion of justice and injustice appear. Since before that, since everyone was allowed to do anything, there wasn't any notion of just and unjust. But when law started to appear, it started.
Okay, all of those are good points. I mean, what you'll find with a lot of these thinkers is that there will be these various ideas that initially seem a bit separate, right? But as you understand them better, you'll start to see how, for instance, his notion of justice is related to, and in a certain sense derived from, his conception, his mechanistic conception of nature, and so on. It all fits together into a very well-structured package, even if it's wrong, and I'm certain that everything Hobbes says is false. It's a quite remarkable and one of the very earliest attempts to give a systematic scientific treatment to the question of the source of political authority, right? It is systematic, as Hassan said. There's this deductive system. Now you notice it's not very strictly deductive. As he starts rolling through the laws of nature, one follows from the other, but the derivation is not always very obvious, right?
And it's not clear and distinct.
It is not clear and distinct. You find this also, we'll see this in Locke as well. Both of them, in fact, most thinkers in this period will say that the source of political power and of the laws of nature is reason. We'll see that's true in both Locke and Hobbes. It's true of many, many others. This is kind of the standard approach in this period, is that since religion is no longer the proper source of political authority, tradition is no longer a source. What can the source be? Well, in a certain sense, it's agreement. It's making agreements with each other. But still, the agreements that we make with each other have to have certain rules that govern them. And this is what we see in Hobbes. It's what all these laws of nature are, right? They're basically rules that govern covenants or contracts. So political authority for Hobbes is based on contract, but contracts themselves are based upon laws. And those laws are nothing but what he calls the laws of reason, that reason finds out. And you say, well, exactly how does reason find it out? In this way, Descartes is much more satisfying because he has this method of clear and distinct ideas, and at least kind of makes sense in applying to geometry, if nothing else. And you can kind of see in Descartes how the deductive method is supposed to follow step by step, right? Whereas in Hobbes, the idea, it's deductive and it's found out by reason, but reason is something much more commonsensical. It's just what seems reasonable to Hobbes. That's what reason tells us, right? To us, many of the things he says won't sound very reasonable, actually. And the reason for that is, what he considers reasonable is not simply what a common person would think is reasonable. What is reasonable is what a common person would think is reasonable if they understood human nature in the way that Hobbes does. So when he says the laws of nature are the rules that reason finds out, he means reason that is intelligent, that is wise, reason that is correct, not just anybody's reason, right? And what is it that we need to have the right functioning reason? We have to have experience, and to have that and what experience in particular? We have to have the experience of our own selves. And remember, he had this this method by which we learn about human nature by looking to our own behavior, right? With some subtleties there. So that's what he means by reason, simply that. And what one would do, what are the rules that one would follow, knowing those things that reason would tell a person. And that's all the laws of nature are. That's all the government is. It's what an intelligent person would do. They didn't make mistakes, and they understood the human beings around them and understood themselves. Those are what the laws of nature are. That's very peculiar to us, right? When he says, if you ask what is right for Hobbes, what is justice ever in any circumstance, it is just what a very clever person looking out for their own interest, because that's his fundamental idea of all human beings, is we're driven by these three things, right? Desire for glory, diffidence, and what?
And competition.
Competition. But there's kind of a super principle there. All three of those are related to essentially self-preservation. The fundamental law of human nature is self-preservation, which means surviving, living, as long as you can, as well as you can, as protected as you can. And there's nothing that, because that's a fundamental law of human nature, and Hobbes understands nature mechanistically, his claim is not really that we ought to preserve ourselves. His claim is that the fundamental law of nature that we do preserve ourselves. In everything that we do, we try to preserve ourselves. But some of us do it intelligently, and some of us do it stupidly. Right? Staying in the state of nature is a stupid way to try to preserve yourself. Because if you truly understood what he's explaining at the beginning of this book, even without changing your goal in life, which is self-preservation, protection, gaining such, you would realize that given certain facts about equality, remember we talked about equality, the fact that we're not stronger than others and so on, if you knew all that, still your desire to preserve yourself would lead you necessarily to adopt the plan of joining a confederacy and making covenants and creating a government and so on. So there's no fundamental change when we move from a state of war to a state of peace. It's simply a state of peace is a more intelligent way in which machines like us, if they have better brains, calculate what the consequences would be. One way I sometimes explain this is, you know, these, you've probably seen these on YouTube or other things where they get these machines, you know, robots in a room, they have to compete for resources, like they have to try to plug themselves in, right? They each have to recharge, and each one starts to try to, have you seen these before? These kinds of things? So this is like experiments in artificial intelligence. So they create these robots, the robots have plans, they have one driving goal, which is to plug themselves in to recharge their batteries. If they don't plug in, they'll die, right? But of course, if they keep fighting the robots, because no robot is bigger than any other, no one gets to plug in, right? So, Daniel, you have your, maybe I can, Daniel.
Sir, it's lagging. I can't hear.
Okay. Well, there was Daniel had a microphone. So anyone else who had their microphone on, please?
Sir, we can't hear you. It's lagging so much.
It is. Can you hear me now? Is it okay?
Now it's clear, yeah.
I'm on campus, so this is the best internet I can get.
Yeah, I think it's just the noise in the background that was interfering.
Yeah, I think I've solved that. So anyways, going back to this idea, this is more or less how Hobbes thinks of the state, right? I said, think of these robot creatures, right, in a room, competing for the resource of electricity. If they're all essentially the same as each other, they just keep pushing each other out of the way, right? One of them tries to plug in, 3 other ones get together and knock him out of the way. No one gets any of the resources. They all drain their batteries, and they all die. But they have some kind of algorithm in there, right? And they run this experiment over and over again, and the robots remember that what they did before doesn't work, and so they try something different, right? Just randomly, until accidentally is hit upon the possibility that if they each take turns, if they don't push each other out of the way, until each one has had maybe a minute of charge time, then they can rotate and all charge, and everything works out, right? And they survive. And then, of course, the next time they run it, they remember that. This is essentially how Hobbes sees human nature. We all want to preserve ourselves. We rush to stupidly, without experience. This is what the state of war is. We just do what we do. And he says, in that state where we can't expect cooperation from anyone else, then we have the right to do whatever we need to try to plug ourselves in, right? But what's the problem with that situation? If you are intelligent, you will know from experience, even him from the Civil War, this English Civil War, he could say, look, nothing good happens in that state. Every time someone gains something, it gets taken away. We all suffer. By all of us trying to win, given the state of what he calls equality of mind and body, no one can win. So the only way is by some kind of mutual agreement, right? And the mutual agreement has to be, because just like robots, but for Hobbes, we have but a few buttons that can be pushed, right? This is one of the parts where people would kind of attack Hobbes's theory later, is that his conception of human nature is people sometimes say it's pessimistic. He doesn't think it's pessimistic, he thinks it's realistic. but people are essentially driven by desire to preserve themselves in fear. That's about it. He sometimes talked about glory and other things, but for him, those are very weak driving forces. The two main forces are really fear and the desire for preservation, right? So what does that mean? It means that in such an agreement between these robots, the only real mechanism for keeping them in check is fear. The main function of the state is to make you afraid of breaking the laws. You give them also, in a certain sense, the right to make you afraid of breaking the laws, right? Because that's the only way human beings are put in check. So there's nothing like, doesn't believe that anyone would realistically do something just out of kindness. That's not in Hobbes's worldview, right? It's not part of human nature. So also, another point, Hassan, are you still hearing me? Is everything fine?
Yes, I'm hearing you perfectly.
Good. As Hassan said, there are these various terms that come up. And why does this happen? Well, when we talked about Bacon, and it was in Descartes too, but we didn't read it, but we could read just about in any of these authors, this concern with language. The fundamental idea, or the general idea being, the meanings of words are not given to us by some divine authority, they're created by human beings. And since the entire medieval period and ancient period of human history, human beings didn't know the truth, words are not well formed, right? The normal significance and meaning of words has to be revised, changed through a new method. Descartes has this stuff too, but we didn't read it. But you saw examples of it, for instance. So for Descartes, so you and I, we talk about a soul. You have all kinds of ideas about what a soul might be, right? Descartes told you a soul is one thing. This is all that a soul can be. What is a soul? Anyone?
In the brain, in the middle, some.
Well, no, that's later. What's the meaning? What's the definition of your soul?
The mind, it's the thinking.
Consciousness.
Thinking.
Yeah.
Understood as consciousness, but thinking, right? The soul is thinking. For him, that's a strict definition. And thinking, this thinking is actually a substance. He calls it res cogitans, thinking stuff. That's what a soul is. Its essence is thought. So there he was redefining a term, right? Many people had Aristotle had a definition of the soul as the form of the body. There were other definitions, of course, other notions of soul in religion and so on. But Descartes wanted to revise the meaning of that word. How did he do that? It was from his method. His method determines the proper meanings of words. So also here, Hobbes's mechanistic worldview makes certain ideas no longer make any sense. Some things aren't possible in such a mechanistic worldview. Once he has also a conception of human nature, there are certain ideas that we have about human nature and words that we use that for him don't make sense anymore. So he has to redefine them. And so words like equality, we saw at the beginning, he redefines it. Why? Because you and I have this notion, and people before had perhaps a notion of equality, not really, maybe a little bit, based on some aspects of religion and other things. But today, for instance, you and I would talk about the value of a human being, something like this, the intrinsic value of humanity, human rights. Hobbes would say, you're talking nonsense. Those things don't exist. What feature of your machine is your human right? Tell me. If a Coke machine can't have it, then you can't have it, right? Unless it's a more complicated mechanism. That's all that there can be. And so if we want to preserve some of those terms like right and just, and we do, why not? We have to redefine them. And this redefining can be very strange, right? For instance, later in the text, he defines good and evil. What is good and evil according to Hobbes? Anyone notice that?
He says
It's up
that
there.
So Hala began. Go ahead.
only exist when there is law, and in a state of nature we cannot distinguish them because anything is.
You're talking about justice and injustice.
Oh, okay.
Good and evil, though.
Didn't he say the same about good and evil?
No, he defines good and evil. It's not so different, but equally strange. Because good is what we want. Evil is what we don't want. Right? Most of us would say that's exactly you mean there's no good and evil? You mean there's just what we want? That's what most of us would think that he's saying. He's saying, no, good is what you want. If you want to kill me, then that is your good. If you want to torture small children, then that is good to you. That's the only sense of good can be, is the object of a desire. There is no good as a kind of eternal truth, unless you want to talk about what God thinks is good. But that's good because God thinks it's good and God wants it. Just as what you think is good for you, and so on and so forth. There is no objective true good that is the same for all of us. Good is the object of desire. That's definitely a redefinition of the notion of good. Yes?
But he still makes like a moral judgment on Native Americans.
Point that out when we get to that part of the text, if you would, so we can read it.
It's in the part where you wait. I have it here. It's on page 179. He says, for the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord whereof dependeth on natural lust. So like my point is that he doesn't call his people when they go to civil war savage. We were also living in peace until the Americans, like till Europeans came. Those are savage to him.
That's a bit subtle. I don't think, first of all, he doesn't use the words good or bad or anything. You're right, he uses the word savage. It's a very common word in the period. Any uncivilized society is savage. We don't speak like that anymore, right?
We don't think like that anymore.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely the language of the British, particularly because it's written in English originally. Yeah, they have all kinds of words that we would no longer use for other cultures than the European. But for him, that's, I think if he were to be consistent, he would have to say, well, he's just talking here, by savage, he means with no civilization, no government, and so on. And so that would apply equally to the English during the Civil War. They would be savage.
Because they were in the state of nature as well.
Yeah. And to him, there's nothing, in fact, not only is there nothing wrong with that, but in a state of war, it's good to be savage, right? That's what each human being ought to be, according to his understanding. Now you say, that's strange. Why ought we to be like that? Because when he says what we ought to do, it's simply what we would do if we were smart. So if you're smart and you live in a state of war, you will be savage, because that's the only way to be and survive. Right? So anyways, we'll come back to various points here. Okay, one other point, just before we continue going. Notice Hobbes was very radical, right? This whole book is, there's a reason it's still read today. Within the tradition of legal theory, he gives almost no role to religion, right? Everything is found out by reason. Now, every now and then, you notice in the text, he he will turn to maybe covenants with God and so on. It's very strange. But his view seems to be that all of that is kind of a private affair. You may have your God, and you may think that your God wants you to do certain things, and you may have made promises with your God and so on, and maybe in that respect, you relate to your God as you do to a king, because you think of your God as like the all-powerful being that will punish you when you die if you don't follow the laws and so on. And then his theory kind of works for that too, he says, right? Your God, out of fear of your God, you do what he says, and his rules about covenants apply there as well. But in a state, religion is a private matter, so we can't rely on any of that. So it ends up being more or less irrelevant to his political theory. But that's a personal issue. And so you can't trust other people. For instance, in a state of nature, he says, the only way that we can form covenants is by promising to our gods. But of course, how do I know your God is not going to come punish you during your life, I presume. So how can I be sure that you actually I should trust your covenant with me? Unless there's a real authority that would come and make you perform it, right? Presently in the world. So religion becomes, it's kind of like he carves out a little place for religion in his political theory, but it can't play any role because not everybody believes in religion, or not everybody has the same religion. He accepts that. Okay.
He also stresses the importance of commonwealth because he says that in the state of nature, no one possesses anything because everyone can take anything from anyone. And so in order to have peace and to ensure that you have certain belongings, you have to have a certain law, certain commonwealth. And for that to be a reality, there should be a state. And so there should be a contract.
There should be a power that can
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the text then. I want to begin right here, kind of at the end of the section where he went through his conception of human nature and his method, right? And he makes a transition to the first and second laws of nature by noting, this is very important, I said this before, it says the passions that incline men to peace are, now what are those? So that incline men to peace, away from war. Fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary for commodious living, and a hope that by their industry to obtain them. That's the same thing that motivated people in a state of war, right? The passions do not change when we go from a state of nature to a condition of nature to a civil condition or a state of peace. It's just like the robots. Their goal is always the same. It's to plug in as long as possible. What changes is what they think with their reason will be the best means to achieve that goal, right? So it's reason. Now, you might remember, this is very much, we saw something like this in Alexander Pope. Remember, he said there were two things that govern human nature, passion and reason. Passion to drive and push, and reason to direct and to design. And those two things together are what produces everything good in nature. Again, that's a very different conception than the medieval conception, where passions are bad, reason is vanity, and faith is the only solution, right? In that worldview, passions are supposed to be extinguished. Here, passions need to be there. They're essential, and there's no way of getting rid of them. That would be getting rid of human nature itself, right? It's an accepted fact that we have these passions. And so fear of death, fear, it's what drove us in a state of war to kill each other. It's the same thing that will drive us in a state of nature, or in a state of government, not to kill each other, right? Same thing, same fear. The difference is in the civil state, the government will kill you if you kill someone else, right? So that keeps you from killing other people. Now, because Hobbes, now before I get into these laws a little bit, because Hobbes has this kind of realism in one sense, but also this kind of mechanical view of human nature. As I said, it's never like, this is what people do, but here's what they ought to do, right? There's only, here's what people do when they're stupid, and here's what people would do when they're smart. And people should do whatever preserves themselves in the circumstances they're in. And if the circumstances change, then what preserves them will change. And so they should do different things, right? So his laws of nature cannot be like absolute. His laws of nature cannot say, in all circumstances, do not kill other human beings. The question is, what will preserve myself long enough? And if that means killing someone, then I should kill someone. If it means not killing someone, then I should not kill someone, right? So the laws can never be like without exception. So his laws of nature, you'll see, always have like clauses, like, well, we'll see, I'll show you. He talks about these as like branches of the laws of nature. And they basically say, every law of nature says, in a state where you can expect the government to be functioning, then you should follow this law. But should you have good reason to think the government is not going to function for you, then you should revert basically to the law of war, the state of war, right? You should revert to the state of war, or you will necessarily, right? So for instance, we should obey civil authorities, but later he'll say, if you are convicted of a crime and you are going to be, say, put to death, then you should resist the government with all of your might. So that's kind of strange, isn't it? He says, but no, because really all he's saying is, because your fundamental law of your nature is to preserve yourself, in a state, if you are smart, you will obey the civil authorities, because otherwise they will destroy you. And if you are punished, however, you do something wrong, you break the laws, and they are going to destroy you, then you will resist them, if you're smart, because that's your only hope. So, you see, on the one hand, he'll say you should follow the laws of the state. On the other, he says, but in this circumstance, it violates the fundamental law of human nature to obey the state, and so you don't obey the state, right? So we'll see this. I'll give you some examples. So the first and second laws of nature and of contracts. So he'll use two words here, contracts and covenants. Covenants are we'll talk about the distinction a little bit, but for now you can treat them more or less as equivalent. The right of nature, so this is about rights. This is our term, we use it today, rights. The right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturale, natural right, is the liberty, so freedom, that's what liberty means. So a right is the liberty each man has to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature. So your right is the freedom to use your power to preserve yourself however you want. That's the right of nature, right? So we can defend our own lives, whatever, do anything which in one's own judgment and reason is conducive to our own preservation. That's the definition of the right of nature. Notice already this is very different from how we speak of rights today. Like what, tell me a right. Someone want to mention to me a right that you have in Lebanon?
Not sure if we have any rights now.
Well, you're supposed to.
Freedom of speech? Don't know.
Is how is that guaranteed in Lebanon?
No,
Constitution?
not at all.
It's
Not
not.
what? It's not. Any other rights? Do you have a Bill of Rights of some form? Maybe you guys should look this up.
Maybe
We
we
have, but you can't really use it or apply it to yourself.
Okay, so they violate it, but in principle, you're supposed to have a Bill of Rights. So what is one of those rights?
Well, we do have the right of freedom of speech and belief and stuff like that, but like it is stated in our constitution, but they don't like respect it much.
Apply.
Don't respect it. Okay, don't say that too loudly.
Sir,
Yeah.
education.
I'm out of 3G. Can you post the lecture as soon as possible in order to do the quiz?
Yeah, I will post it. Okay, so think about that. If you name any of these rights, they're generally they're protections, right? They're protections from others so that you can do certain things. Other people can't stop you from doing them. That is completely different from the notion of right that's being used here. Here, the right of nature is the freedom to do anything that's in your power to do. First of all, that's not a protection from anyone else. If someone cannot, so let's say I want to, my right is to take your children from you and turn them into my slaves, right? So is that part of the right of nature? Well, if it's within my power to do so, right? But if it's not in my power to do so, it's not a right of nature. So if you're powerful enough to keep me from stealing your children, then I don't have the right to do so. But if I do have the power to take your children, then I have the right to do so. So the term right here doesn't make any kind of restrictions on what I can do. It's just whatever I can do. That's what's right. That's what freedom is.
It's opposed to Locke's view on the rights of people, because Locke he believes that everyone should do whatever to preserve themselves and others. No one can destroy other people. But here he says that you can do whatever you want, even destroy others in order to preserve yourself.
Yeah. We'll see in Locke that in a state of nature or a condition of nature, there are already laws. How can there be laws? Well, because he has this idea of God. God is the source of these laws, right? So we'll see that. So it is very different, and their rights are more like what we talk about them. They seem like protections, right? Freedoms to do things. Whereas, although Hobbes equates right with freedoms or liberties, those are just what you actually in fact have. Whatever freedom you actually in fact have in a state of nature, that is your freedom. There's no freedom you ought to have. I can't deprive you of your freedom in a state of nature. All right? It's not possible.
I'm confused, but you're saying that it's your freedom, like you can have your freedom, but you can't deprive other people of other people's freedoms. But by like hurting other people, aren't you depriving them of their freedom?
So just redefine, just no longer say to yourself, I think I know what freedom means. Say, freedom is a dummy word, right? And Hobbes is going to give it a meaning. And Hobbes is saying freedom is whatever you can do.
But that's why when you go back to the definition of his, the way he defined liberty and the right to do something, that's why he's like suggesting the power of a strong governor who will basically control and make sure that you are protected, because at the end of the day, anyone like going back to the state of nature, like you have rights, but you are not protected. But we should give up some of the rights and the freedom we have when we elect someone powerful that can make sure we feel protected.
Yes. But to go back to the confusion that was there, you and I tend to always, we think of freedoms as things that we ought to have. It's so built into our notion of freedom that it's like, I have free speech. What does that mean? It means you aren't allowed to stop me from speaking. That's not how Hobbes thinks of freedom. Freedom is like, I am free to move my arm up, right? I can do that. But if you hold my arm down, I don't have the freedom to raise my arm. Right?
But didn't he also say that you should fight for your self-preservation? So you should have the freedom to fight and move your arm, in a sense.
You will do so. It's not that you should. It's just a fact. Either I can or I can't. Either you're holding my arm down or you're not. Think of it like a machine, right? Not like what we ought to do or anything like that. He uses that language sometimes, but it doesn't function the way you and I use it. If I have a freedom, you can then take it away from me and it's no longer my freedom, right? If my arms are tied down, I am not free to move them. It doesn't mean that I ought to be able to move them. Now, I may try to move them, as you're saying, right? I may want the freedom to do that, but I don't have it. I don't have that freedom. In the same way, in a state, freedoms are freedoms that we had in a state of nature disappear, right? Because we hand over the power to the state to control us and so on. Okay, so anyways, the right here is equated with liberty, which is equated with whatever we can actually do, right? Whatever I actually can do, I have a right to do. If I can steal your children, I have a right to steal your children. If I can't steal your children because you're stronger than me, then I don't have a right to steal your children. Same with liberty, they function together. So here you see it. Liberty is understood, according to the proper signification of the word, the absence of external impediments. Freedom is nothing but the absence of things stopping me from doing something. So if something stops me from doing something, then I don't have freedom with respect to it, period, right? Just like you might say freedom is like a body's ability to move through space unless something stops it, right? If something stops it, it's not free to move. If nothing stops it, then it's free to move, right? Just as mechanistically straightforward. The law of nature, lex naturalis, is a precept or a general rule found out by reason. Again, reason is the source of the laws of nature. Notice these are not laws. These laws, as I said before, are the laws within a civil state, most of them, right? So they say laws of nature doesn't mean that they apply in the state of war. The state of war is when we haven't yet used reason to figure out what the best course of action is. Once we use reason, we become intelligent, then we discover the laws of nature which lead us to establish a state, right? So a law of nature is a general precept found out by reason, by which man is forbidden to do that which is destructive to his life or taketh away the means of preserving his life, and to omit that by which he thinketh it may be best preserved. A law of nature, in other words, is nothing but what an intelligent person using their reason would do if they were in fact attempting to preserve their own lives. Whatever course of action is required to best preserve your life, that is a law of nature, right? Any question there?
So we can also go backwards, right?
Yeah.
For example, if we had a state that everything's functioning well and we have like reason and intelligence, we can still go back to the state of nature and misuse our reasoning.
We can only. No, I mean, Hobbes, I think, would say we couldn't if the state was functioning well, and our intelligence wasn't somehow broken. We couldn't, because he doesn't believe in freedom in the sense of like the ability to. He would say that what you're talking about is nonsensical. You're saying, would a robot that had a program that told it to preserve itself and follow the rule of preserving itself, and it had found the best rule to preserve itself, could that robot go back and do something differently? You say, no, it couldn't, right? Not unless you destroyed its memory, you destroyed its computer chip, or you altered the circumstances, in which case it was no longer the right course of action to preserve itself, right? So he doesn't think human beings can just kind of, that notion of like freedom to do whatever we want and to violate the laws of our own nature, a law of my nature, principle of human nature, is that I preserve myself. I'm not free to not do that. I just do it badly sometimes if I'm confused.
Okay, thank you.
Even suicide would be an example for him of like confusion, right? You're not really trying to destroy yourself. You're trying to preserve yourself, but by some very stupid means, right? Maybe the most stupid possible means. So a law of nature, okay. So now he even notices that the way that he's defined these terms is even contrary to the way he talked about, that they were talked about in his own period. So he says, for though they speak of this subject, they that speak of this subject use to confound jus and lex, right and law, right? So he thinks that people that spoke about these terms before confounded, what does that mean? Confused,
yeah.
Right? Right and law. They thought a law gives us rights, right? This is what we tend to say today. A law protects your rights, right? There's a law, don't, it's against the law to violate someone's freedom of speech. That through that law, their right is protected, right? For him, that's a confusion. That makes no sense to him. Because right is liberty to do whatever we can do, whereas law is something that restricts what we can do. They're opposed to each other. They ought to be distinguished, right and law, because right consists in the liberty to do or to forbear, right? Which means not to do, to choose not to do, whereas law determineth and bindeth to one of them. Liberty is the ability to do whatever we want, but law doesn't allow us to do whatever we want. So the law and right differ as much as obligation and liberty. Being bound, that's what the term obligation linguistically goes back to be bound, right? Tied to something. A law ties you, whereas liberty is freedom. So law and right are opposed to one another. The establishment of laws requires the destruction of rights. So in a sense, well, Hobbes is going to argue two things. On the one hand, kind of straightforwardly, it looks like we give up rights in a state of, when we move from a state of nature to a civil society, because we allow laws to govern us. And so we give up rights. But on another hand, we don't give up rights. What we give up are the rights that we had in a state of, in a condition of nature. And what we get in exchange is the ability to actually pursue those things that we wanted all along. And so in a certain sense, we gain. You have to go back to this idea that what really is happening when we go to a civil state. We realize that although we had the right maybe now to do anything I wanted to, none of that actually achieved what I wanted it to in a state of war. But in a civil state, I, for the first time, get to do a lot of the things I wanted to do. I can't do others. But those things I want to do actually have the goal and achieve what I want them to achieve, right? And so since he equates freedom and right with the ability to do what you want to do and lack of impediments, in a certain sense, in a civil state, I'm exchanging some impediments for getting rid of others. And overall, I'm able to do more in a civil state than I am in a state of nature. So in a certain sense, I have more liberty, more right in the civil state, because I've exchanged that one big boulder of civil war for lots of little ones that block individual actions and open up the way in between them to do other things, like open a business, drive my car around, and so on without being murdered. Okay. Okay, now here in the next paragraph, he talks about the state of war and what the consequence is for his notion of right, right? And as we know now, there's no reason to dwell on this. It says, following from the above, in the condition of war, every man has a right to everything, even to another's body, right? Which in a certain sense means you have no, for us would mean no one has any rights. From our point of view, that would mean there are no rights, right? You have no protections whatsoever from anyone else. But for him, that's absolute right, because you have the right to do anything you want to anyone else. So that's
he's
right.
not wrong.
He's not wrong.
He sounds actually like he's the most one that makes sense out of all the people that we have read so far, because like it doesn't make sense. Like there are no laws to bind us, so my liberty doesn't stop at your liberty, because well there's nothing stopping me from doing whatever I want, and that is like it could be called the right of nature, whether it is good or wrong by society or by whatever we say afterwards, but like in that moment it's not right or wrong, and I have every right to do so. So I don't know, he seems to be very, very like sensical. He does like he has a point, a very good point, I think.
Well, Christoph, I hope I don't come across you in a dark alley anywhere.
Well, we do live in a civilized in a civilized state, so.
But if you can get away with it, if you have a good, reasonable chance of getting away with it, then it's reasonable to revert.
Well, sadly, I do fear the law.
Which is also why in a dark alleyway, I have the right, I don't have to, for instance, wait for a judge to find you guilty if you attack me or anything. We suddenly, there's a little war that takes place and I get the right to kill you suddenly. So you
yes,
want that as well.
And justice becomes personal, and it wouldn't be what the state states.
Because in that situation,
so
it's reasonable to think that there's policemen around that can protect me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. There is Hobbes appeals to a lot of people's understanding of things because for a good reason, right? He is very consistent, and you can see kind of, although it's a very different way of thinking about rights and so on than we use now, there are many people who believe this is more or less correct, right? Think that other stuff is nonsense.
Yes, like it is very dark and pessimistic, but it's pretty realistic in a sense.
And of course, his response to that is it's not pessimistic, it's just the truth, right? Everything else is stupidity, basically. Can't be pessimistic. It's just like, is the way machines operate, is that pessimistic? I mean, what does that even mean? They just do what they do, and you either understand that or you don't.
Yes.
Okay. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man, how strong or wise soever he be, of living out the time which nature ordinary alloweth men to live. So no one is safe in such a state. And consequently, now he's going to draw a conclusion. It is a precept or general rule of reason. We're getting to the first law of nature. that every man ought to endeavor peace. Ought here, again, not because he's a bad person if he doesn't do that, but rather, or she, but he's going to talk about men because this is Hobbes and this is the English in the 18th
He's a
century.
smart person.
It means if he's smart, he will endeavor peace, as far as he has the hope of attaining it. Now notice, again, I said there's always a condition. He ought to endeavor peace. He's smart to endeavor peace, as far as he has hope of obtaining it. If there's no realistic hope of obtaining it, then he ought not to endeavor it, right? That would be stupid. If he has no hope that others will agree with him, or if every other human being was a liar, and he could not trust them in any way, and the government could never be truly established because no covenants could be established, then give up. Then it would be stupid, and the first law of nature would be this book would be over, right? It would say, use all means you have in a state of war to survive. End of book. But no, there seems to be other people that are as intelligent as us, and we can make some agreements, and maybe we have some reasonable hope of obtaining peace. And to that extent, we should do so. And when he cannot, and so notice again, the condition goes on, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. Right? It's got both built into the rule. The first branch of this, so the first part of this, the first branch he calls it, of which rule containeth the first and fundamental law of nature. So the first and fundamental law of nature is this: endeavor peace as far as we can obtain it, right? Seek peace and follow it. The second, the sum of the right of nature, is by all means we can to defend ourselves. These are the two fundamental laws. By all means to defend ourselves. Of course, these are going to come into conflict, right? In some cases. For instance, if I in a state am found guilty of a crime and sentenced to death, then this one is the one that trumps the other, right? There's no possibility of why? Because the ultimate law of human nature is to preserve oneself. So in a certain sense, this is much closer, right? We only seek peace insofar as it can be used to preserve ourselves.
But then he would be contradicting himself, because like he said, okay, so I have every right to defend myself, but if I become a rebel, then like it's against reason and it's what should not be done. So what should I do? Like, do I rebel? Do I defend myself and rebel? Or I don't defend myself.
Rebel. So there are two questions here. Is it ever proper for people to rebel against their government in general? As a kind of, as like a group, right? And we get together and attack the Lebanese government and try to take it down. And he says no, absolutely not, for a basic reason, that an intelligent person, again, that kind of idea, this is not his language, but this is how he's thinking. An intelligent person would, by every means, avoid civil war. Because civil war is as much as death. It's returning to a natural state where life is where you're going to die, probably, or live miserably. However, as an individual, it may end up that I'm in a situation where the state is going to destroy me. And then should I rebel against the state? Absolutely, for Hobbes. It's one of he even builds it into his laws of nature. So why does he do that? And I see your point. It seems contradictory, but for Hobbes, it's not. It's perfectly consistent. This is I'm deriving everything from this fundamental principle of self-preservation. So in a state, the smart person is intelligent enough to preserve themselves through the means given by the state. But if the state should try to destroy them, then to hell with the state. The only reason we ever had the state was to preserve myself in the first place. So if it's going to destroy me, then what do I care? My fundamental rule is preserve myself, right?
Yeah.
So for the same reason, you cannot, Hobbes is going to say later, one of the laws of nature is that you cannot require someone to testify against themselves. You cannot make covenants that would take away your own life. These things are impossible, and so are not true covenants for him. They may seem to be covenants. I may make a contract with you and sign it that you have the right on Thursday to kill me. But Hobbes says it's void in a state. Because a person can't actually make such a contract. Their mouths can move, the words on the page can say those words, but we can't actually mean what we say. Because the only purpose of a true covenant is in some way to preserve ourselves. And so a covenant to destroy ourselves is a contradiction. Right?
Because he's speaking from experience, because during the English War, he was a royalist and he was supporting the king. So that's why he did not support the idea of like people rebelling against the king.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, probably Hobbes's conception, I mean, many countries have experienced civil war, and you could say, well, maybe it's because he's a royalist, but he's probably a royalist because a lot of people probably were royalists because civil war is so terrible. And they see that as the only real option, right? So it doesn't mean, I'm sure there are people who, there can be royalists who kind of believe in the right of kings and so on.
Maybe he relates this to experience, because he says that the more you have experience, the more wise you are. And so he experienced both. He experienced the state of nature and he experienced this in a bad government. And he's saying that in this case, having a bad government is better than having no government at all.
Yeah.
And he says that we willingly agreed to this government. So we cannot back out because it's a contract, and even if it was a vote and some people voted for someone else, let's say, they agreed that after the vote, the person with the most votes will govern. So, no matter who ends up being the leader, we would have agreed to this, so we cannot back out.
Yeah, I mean, of course, he doesn't have this idea of voting. They didn't have it. And for Hobbes, I mean, but the first points you make are very good about this experience and so on. Because I wanted to say, if he were just like a pure royalist, he probably would have just defended the right of the king on traditional religious grounds. That was still the main way to do so. But you can see that his fundamental change that he has is that the true function of government is to ensure peace. He sees everything through that lens. The function and limit of government power, its source of power is its ability to bring peace and to facilitate our personal pursuit of our own preservation. Right? So even if it's not possible to rebel against your king and so on, it still gives a different conception of what a kingdom is about. It's not about the absolute rule. We are not the property of our kings, for Hobbes. That's not how it works. We give our kings, we have kings for our own purposes. We're supposed to benefit. Now, it so happens that this issue about not rebelling makes it so that we kind of seem like property of our kings. It's a rough spot in his theory, right? The king's supposed to serve us, but because a king, any king, even a horrible king is better than civil war, kings can get away with quite a bit, nevertheless. So this is obviously why people, even who would have been sympathetic to Hobbes, might have thought his theory needed some adjustments. It led to some problems. So anyways, okay. So from this fundamental law of nature, by which men are commanded to endeavor peace, is derived, right, the second law. That a man be willing, when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself shall think it necessary, to lay down this right to all things. So the second law of nature, notice it kind of does follow, right? You could see how it might follow, like, and this is what I would say about this deduction. Really what Hobbes is doing is he's starting with the first principle and he's saying, the first principle is endeavor peace as much as one can hope to obtain it. And in the case you can't hope to obtain it, endeavor war. But insofar we take that one branch, insofar as it seems possible to actually endeavor peace, then to do so, the only means to do so is by giving up some of our rights that we had in a condition of nature. So the deduction works like this. The first principle is endeavor peace. The second law says one of the necessary means to endeavoring peace is giving up our rights. So the second law is giving up those rights. You see how the derivation works there? It says means to the acquisition of a goal. The goal is peace. So it's similar to like saying if you want to build a house, that's the fundamental principle, build a house. Well, if I build a house, I have to have wood. So second law, acquire wood, right? I got a nail to build a house. I gotta have nails to link the wood together. Second law, get some nails, right? And of course, each law would be like this: get wood insofar as you have the hope of building a house, and insofar as you have no hope of building a house, do not acquire wood, right? If you have the hope to acquire a house, second law, acquire nails, insofar as you may not have the hope to build a house because it might be blown down by the wind, then don't get nails because it would be pointless, right? In either case, it's kind of like a policy of the best course of action to pursue the goal which you have, right?
Because in the end, the goal is to preserve life. And it's a bit ironic, but it makes sense in the same time, because you have the right to do anything in your power to preserve your life. Yeah. But by giving up certain rights, you are doing so. You are preserving your life because you are protecting yourself from other people's liberty. So in a way, yeah,
exactly.
balances itself out.
So in fact, the first fundamental principle of human nature is to preserve oneself. The first law that comes from that, the only reasonable way to preserve oneself is to endeavor peace insofar as is possible, right? If it's possible, but if it's not possible, then don't. Then the only way to endeavor peace is to give up those rights. The rights to kill everybody else. That makes sense, right? Can't have peace without giving up my right to killing everyone else. And they're giving up their right to kill me, and so on, right? So necessary to lay down the rights to all things and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself, right? This is reciprocal. Notice that Hobbes immediately, as people do in this period, they give a kind of scientific, what they call a scientific, systematic rule that they derive this law, second law of nature, and then they say, that's what the Bible told us anyways, right? It was revealed to us, but now I've shown you the basis of it, scientifically. What did the gospel tell us? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? Same thing. Well, not really, because now we have an interpretation of it. I don't think in the Bible it meant give up your right to kill everybody else so that they give up their right so that you both can live as long as possible. I don't think that's what the gospel meant. But he does say, well, the gospel said, whatsoever you require that others should do to you, that do ye to them, right? It's reciprocal. I give up my rights and you give up your rights. Why? Because it would be stupid to give up your rights and not have anyone else give up theirs, right? You would just be sheep to the slaughter, right?
Locke arrives to the same conclusion, but he uses a different, he starts with a different, let's say, premise and ends up saying that you have the right to do to others what they do to you. But it's interpreted in different ways.
Locke has this peculiar idea that we're all God's property. We're all the property of God. And so we have a duty to preserve God's other property. So we have a duty not to kill other people. It would be like your sheep eating each other. If they're good sheep, they're not going to do that because they're destroying your property. So there's this reciprocal. We each try to preserve God's property, and we're all God's property, so we preserve each other. So you're right. Locke has a completely different idea. And since God exists in a state of nature, in the natural state, we should not kill each other and so on. There are laws already for Locke, not for Hobbes. Okay, to lay down man's right to anything is to divest himself of the liberty of hindering another of the benefit of his own right to the same. So to lay down your right is to give up your liberty of hindering another, right? For that he renounces or passes away his right, giveth not to any other man a right which he had not before. So by giving up your rights, you don't give anyone else rights, because they had all right to everything that they had before, right? Because there is nothing to which every man had not right by nature. But by giving up your rights, you only stand out of that person's way that he may enjoy his original right without hindrance, not without hindrance from another. So that the effect which redoundeth to one man, bounces back, is what it means, right? The effect that bounces back to one man by another man's defect of right is but so much diminution of impediments to the use of his own original right. So the only thing you get in return for giving up your rights is lack of impediments to the remaining rights that you have, right? Simple enough. So really, this is not a restriction of the original right, if properly understood. Yes, Hassan?
I was saying, if you trust that the other man will stick to the covenant.
Of course, and if you don't, then all bets are off, and you should do something else. You should kill him, take his children, as so on, right? Now let me say something about it. You probably found this a very odd text, difficult to read for several reasons. The English is very difficult, but also there's a lot of stuff in here you probably were thinking, why in the hell is he spending his time talking about a lot of contractual stuff? It's very lawyerly, right? Like, what does it mean to say, I promise? When can a promise, by what means can you display a promise? By writing, by words, by signs, and so on. So Hobbes is not just giving what he thinks is a political theory in general. This is supposed to be something that is used by jurists and judges and people in the government to determine how they might structure things. And so it has to go into all of those really minor details. The first part here is about the laws of nature, but more importantly, we saw it's also about the notion of a covenant or a contract. And so contract law, if any of you want to become lawyers, you can study contract law. It's very detailed business, right? What are the conditions of contracts and so on. And so that's what he's doing, and probably a quarter of this text is actually not very important for us. But the problem is it's all mixed all throughout the text. So here, he's talking about how we renounce our rights or transfer our rights. Now, some, of course, in a civil state are going to be given up, like murdering other people and so on. Those are all going to be given up at once. But we're also within a state, there are contracts like to purchase goods and so on and so forth, right? And in those, we're also transferring rights. I'm transferring the right of my property to you in exchange for cash and so on. I may rent something from you. I may give you money now for the delivery of goods tomorrow. All those things to him require different conditions, because all of those, each of those is reasonable to enter into and to obey based upon certain very concrete facts, right? For instance, if something's in the future, it's not reasonable to me to obey that contract where I deliver something to you now and you pay me for it tomorrow, if there's no way I can see that it would be enforced that you would pay me tomorrow. And then then that's not a true contract and I shouldn't make that contract. So all of these things have to be given in detail, right? Okay, so a right is laid aside either by renouncing it or transferring it to another, by simply renouncing when he cares not to whom the benefit thereof redoundeth, by transferring when he intendeth the benefit thereof to some certain person or persons. This is generally what we'll do in contracts, right?
Sir, time's up.
Ah, yes, you're right. Okay, this is where we will start tomorrow. I'm sorry about
Sir,
the internet. There's nothing I can do. I will post the video for those who asked.
Yeah, please.
Thank you.
All right, see you all tomorrow.
Professor, I have a question about the assignments that we have to do, if any, because on the website it says that we have a video project.
Yes. I'm going to make a document soon. By the end of this week, I'll share with you the video assignment details. That's the only assignment I believe you are talking about, correct?
Yeah, that and the final, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Other questions? All right then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.